Hello and welcome back to the From Moses to Mookie podcast. If you've been following along in this series, you know that we are talking about Major League Baseball's declining black population. Over the last 35 years, the black population has dropped from 18.4% in 1984 to 6.4% in 2016. We've talked about some of the reasons for this, and one of the reasons why baseball became so popular in the black community was because the Negro Leagues provided fans and black people in black communities with the opportunity to go watch professional baseball played by people who looked like them, played by people who had experienced the same things as them. That sort of relatability resulted in a mutual interest on both parties, by the teams and by the fans, and that allowed baseball to grow in the black community, allowing players to inspire other players and then future generations down the road. What you see then later is that whenever the Negro Leagues began to lose players to Major League Baseball did not have the same kind of incentive because they were already established in their communities. They did not really have an interest in supporting black communities and advancing black interests as the Negro Leagues had. So there's a slow and steady decline in investment by Major League Baseball. They've gotten better in the last couple of years, but in general, there has not been the same incentive for investment. Then we looked at how just the logistics of baseball have really led to its decline nationally among all demographics, but especially in the black population, because on average, black families do not make as much money as white families do. And because baseball is expensive, whether you're talking about the equipment or you're talking about joining a team, or you're talking about how players typically have to pay for their school because educational opportunities are not as available, black families cannot afford to invest in baseball. And then you have communities who may not be able to invest in baseball because they don't have the space to do so. You have 130,000 square feet for a baseball field, whereas you can use 4,700 square feet for a regulation basketball court. It's almost a no-brainer when it comes to finances because one is easier to maintain than the other. It's smaller, yes, but it's also cheaper to build and then to maintain. What we're going to talk about today is a little bit different. We're going to talk about one of the reasons why black Americans have been, I wouldn't say ignored, but they haven't been prioritized. The major reason for this is labor cost. And I'm going to get into this and be really specific about this because I think it's very interesting. So let's imagine that you're a CEO of a company. As a CEO, or even as an owner or as a general manager of a branch, your job is to get the most amount of output from your employees while paying those employees the lowest possible cost. I'm not saying that's right. I'm not saying that's wrong. It is a little sketchy, however. It's not necessarily the most moral, the most fair thing, but I'm not going to say it's right or wrong. I'm saying that that's just how the system is right now. If I wanted to argue for or against it, that would be a whole separate podcast. But you're paying employees at the lowest possible amount so that you can get the most possible output. If I told you that you could get the best possible employees out of a specific region, and you could pay them at a lower rate than you would be able to an average employee, what would you do? Would you sign that? Would you sign that employee? Would you want to get them, knowing that you could get them for a very cheap amount and then make sure that they had a high production value? Absolutely. The way that Major League Baseball is set up is in that way. The best talent right now is coming out of Puerto Rico, out of Cuba, out of the Dominican Republic. Those three countries are a farm system for Major League Baseball. The best talent is coming from there, and typically those players will sign relatively inexpensively. Teams are typically given about $5 million to go out and sign international players. The top prospects, if you want to look back a couple of years ago, Miguel Sano of the Twins, a 2017 All-Star, signed for a little over $3 million. You compare that to Dansby Swanson, who was drafted in 2015 by the Diamondbacks. He signed for $6 million. He is not an all-star. He is having a very good season so far, but he's definitely not an all-star right now. When you compare the numbers, you compare talent and you compare the cost, Major League Baseball teams are much more incentivized to recruit international talent and spend more time investing in that kind of in Latin American talent than they are in domestic talent, because the Latin American talent is cheaper. The Latin American talent is more productive. They're going to win more games. They're going to put more people in stands, and therefore they're going to make you more money. This is not to say that the black community has no chance to be drafted or go to the major leagues, because the draft does exist. 75% of players, according to Baseball America, either attended 2 universities or 4-year universities. And those are the players, again, that got drafted. But as we can see from the last episode, African Americans who live in urban areas who make less money cannot afford to play on showcase teams, which means they are probably not going to play at major Division I schools, which means they are probably not going to be drafted as highly, at least, as a white kid who's playing at Texas. So there's less of an incentive for black players, again, to play baseball because the investment just isn't there. Instead of using that money, that $5 million, to invest in homegrown talent or to build programs for these inner city baseball programs, teams are instead signing and exploiting Latin American countries for their talent. And that's led to a even more dramatic increase in the Latin American population than in the decrease in the black population. In 1984, the same year that we begin to see the decline in the black population, the Latin American population begins to skyrocket. In 1984, the Latin American population represented only 12% of the league, but in 2016, the Latin American population represented 27.4% of the league. And again, these players are fantastic. You're talking about Francisco Lindor of the Indians, Javier Baez of the Cubs, Robinson Cano of the New York Mets, and plenty of others. I mean, a wide variety of representation of Latin American talent across Major League Baseball. So the production that comes out of Latin America is absolutely worth the cost because the cost is so low. If you tell me that I only had to pay half as much for solid, really good all-star talent as I could for average talent in the MLB draft, I would absolutely spend my time and my resources, and I would really invest in that baseball. So I think that the draft and the focus on Latin American players is really taking away from the focus on black players, because it's what financial reason do teams have to go after black players who may not be as good as the Latin American players? That's simply, if a general manager or an owner did that and they invested in just average talent at a higher price instead of getting the best talent at a low price, fans and players themselves would be irritated because it wouldn't seem fair. It wouldn't seem right. It wouldn't seem as though they're really trying to help the team win. So in order to get the black population back in the major leagues, I think that we're going to need to see a shift in the way that we handle international signing. But that's not for this episode. That's actually for the next episode. So thank you for tuning in on this episode and for hearing a little bit about how the Latin American population has coincided with the declining black population. I hope you join me on the next episode where we're going to talk about some of the ways that I think Major League Baseball can right some of these wrongs and invest in the black community and to get black population in Major League Baseball back on the rise.